This is the big, beautiful bill. It's over 900 pages long, and it could reshape everything from your Social Security benefits to your Medicare coverage to how much you owe in taxes. Most people will never read it, so I did. And today, we're focusing on what it means for seniors. From surprise tax breaks to changes in healthcare and benefits, I'll show you exactly what's inside. Some parts are great, others, not so much. Let's break it down clearly, simply, and one step at a time. So let's start with something that could really impact a lot of people, especially if you're over 65 and still filing taxes every year. There's a section in the new bill that creates something called a senior tax deduction, and it's honestly a big deal. Basically, if you're 65 or older, this would let you take an extra $6,000 off your taxable income. That's on top of the standard deduction you already get, which is already a bit higher for seniors. And guess what? This new deduction applies whether you're retired, still working part-time, or just living on Social Security and a little savings. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, wait, haven't we always had a little bit of an extra break as seniors? And yeah, technically there's been an increased standard deduction for folks over 65, but this is different. This is a separate line item, a full $6,000 deduction that stacks on top of what's already there. It's called a temporary senior deduction in the bill, but it's designed to be available every year from now through 2028. So here's how it works. If you file your taxes as a single person and you're 65 or older, you could deduct $6,000 from your income before calculating how much you owe. If you're married and both spouses are over 65, you each get it. That's $12,000 total. It's not a credit, so it doesn't reduce your taxes dollar for dollar, but it does lower your taxable income, which means potentially a smaller tax bill or maybe no tax bill at all, depending on your situation. But here's the thing. This deduction starts to phase out if you make more than a certain amount. If your income is below $75,000 as an individual or $150,000 as a couple, you can take the full deduction. But once you go above $75,000 as a single filer or $150,000 as a couple filing jointly, the deduction gradually phases out using a 6% reduction formula. There is no fixed cutoff, but it can fully phase out as income rises. So if you're just living off of Social Security or Social Security plus a small pension or maybe some retirement savings, you'll probably qualify for the full thing. But if you're still earning a solid income, or taking large withdrawals from a retirement account, it might not do much for you. And yeah, I already know what some of you are thinking. Does this mean I'll pay less taxes on my Social Security? Well, sort of. This deduction does not reduce your adjusted gross income, so it doesn't directly change how your Social Security is taxed. It reduces your taxable income after AGI is calculated, which means it won't affect whether your Social Security benefits are taxable. Also, just to be clear, this isn't something you have to opt into. It would be automatic when you file your taxes, assuming you meet the age and income criteria. But of course, it's always good to check with someone or run your numbers through tax prep software to make sure it's applied correctly. And even though this might sound pretty generous, it's not permanent. Right now, it's only set to last through 2028. After that, it disappears unless Congress passes another law to extend it. So yeah, it's a temporary benefit, but a helpful one, especially if you're on a fixed income and every dollar counts. Now let's talk about what the bill says about Social Security benefits, because the next section might just change how your benefits are taxed altogether. Now let's talk about something that's been frustrating people for years, and that's the fact that Social Security, which you paid into your whole life, can still be taxed when you finally start receiving it. A lot of folks expected this new bill to put an end to that. After all, many of the headlines made it sound like lower and middle-income seniors were finally going to stop paying federal taxes on their Social Security benefits. But here's the truth. The bill doesn't actually eliminate those taxes. As of now, the rules around how Social Security is taxed haven't changed. That means depending on how much other income you have, like IRA withdrawals, pensions, or even interest income, up to 85% of your benefits can still be counted as taxable income. What the bill does include is a new $6,000 deduction for people age 65 and older, which we talked about earlier. And while that can help reduce your taxable income, it doesn't directly change how Social Security itself is taxed. It might lower your overall income enough that you owe less tax on your benefits, and that's great, but the underlying IRS formula, known as the provisional income calculation, is still in place. So just to be clear, the thresholds you've heard about, $75,000 for individuals and $150,000 for married couples, those apply to the senior deduction, not to Social Security taxes. There is no new cap or cutoff where your benefits suddenly become tax-free. Also, the bill doesn't replace the current system with something simpler. The sliding scale, the income brackets, the inclusion of half your Social Security in the calculation, all of that remains the same. And if you live in a state that taxes Social Security benefits, that part doesn't change either. This bill only applies to federal income tax. States like Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico may still take a cut, depending on how their rules are set up. It's also worth noting that this has no effect on how much you actually receive from Social Security each month. Your benefit amount doesn't change. This is strictly about how the IRS treats it when you file your taxes. So in short, this bill doesn't eliminate taxes on Social Security. It doesn't set new income thresholds for exempting your benefits. And it doesn't simplify the formula. What it does do is offer a new deduction that might help some seniors lower their overall tax bill, and that could indirectly reduce how much of your Social Security is taxed. But that's as far as it goes. That said, there's a different part of the bill that does offer direct relief for a lot of seniors, and that's Medicare. So let's move on and talk about what's changing there, especially when it comes to those high out-of-pocket prescription drug costs. All right, so let's talk about Medicare now, specifically prescription drug costs. I know this is a major concern for so many of you, especially if you're on a fixed income and trying to juggle medications that just seem to keep getting more expensive. This section of the bill makes a pretty important change to how much you can be charged out of pocket under Medicare Part D. Starting in 2026, there would be a $2,000 cap on your total out-of-pocket drug costs for the year. And that's a hard cap. Once you hit $2,000, that's it. No more paying extra at the pharmacy, no matter what the drug costs after that. Now, if you've ever been stuck in that weird donut hole in Medicare Part D, where you're paying more than you expected mid-year, even though you're still covered, this cap might come as a big relief. Because right now, even with recent reforms, people can still spend thousands of dollars out of pocket depending on what medications they're taking. Cancer drugs, insulin, even certain inhalers, these can all stack up quickly. So with this change, the bill is basically saying, look, no senior on Medicare should have to spend more than $2,000 per year on prescription meds. Period. And you might be wondering, does this apply to all types of Medicare? Well, this is just for Part D, which is the part that covers outpatient prescriptions, the medications you pick up at the pharmacy. It doesn't apply to drugs you get in a hospital or infusion setting under Part B, but it still covers a pretty wide range of what most people use on a daily or monthly basis. Now, here's another thing this section does. It improves how the actual prices are negotiated. The bill expands Medicare's authority to negotiate drug prices directly with manufacturers. That's something we've seen bits and pieces of in previous legislation, but this would increase the number of drugs subject to negotiation, and it happens faster. The goal is that lower negotiated prices, combined with this $2,000 cap, will help make your medication costs more stable and predictable. So, instead of crossing your fingers at the pharmacy counter, you'll have a much clearer idea of what your yearly costs will look like. There's also a provision tucked in here that helps smooth out those costs over the year. Instead of having to pay a huge chunk early in the year if your medication is expensive, like in January or February, you can choose to spread out your payments monthly, almost like an installment plan. That can help a lot with budgeting, especially if you're balancing bills and groceries and everything else on a tight income. And one last thing, this doesn't just affect people who are already enrolled in Medicare. If you're turning 65 soon or helping a parent or spouse manage their care, this could seriously change how you plan for retirement health costs. So yeah, Medicare Part D has always been complicated, but this is one of the clearer fixes we've seen in a while. It doesn't solve everything, but it puts a real limit on what you'll have to pay, and that kind of predictability can make a big difference. Next, we'll look at another part of the bill that quietly affects long-term care through Medicaid, and for folks in nursing homes or who rely on Medicaid to help cover assisted living. It's something you'll definitely want to hear. So now let's talk about Medicaid, specifically how it relates to long-term care. Because a lot of people don't realize this, but Medicaid actually covers the majority of long-term nursing home care in the U.S., especially for folks who've spent down their savings or who never had a lot of assets to begin with. This section of the bill makes a few key changes to Medicaid eligibility and how the program handles long-term care coverage. And while some of these sound technical on paper, they could have a real impact on the day-to-day lives of seniors, especially those in nursing homes or assisted living facilities. One of the big changes is about how much home equity you're allowed to have and still qualify for Medicaid long-term care. Right now, there's a cap. You can't have unlimited equity in your primary residence and still qualify. But this bill would recalculate that home equity limit, possibly lowering it or freezing future increases. So if you own a home and need Medicaid to help pay for long-term care, this could affect your eligibility. It's not saying you'll lose your home, but it does mean the rules around counting your home's value might become stricter. That could lead to more people having to do things like spend down assets, take out reverse mortgages, or even restructure ownership to qualify. Another important piece is about eligibility redeterminations. That's the process states use to check whether you still qualify for Medicaid. This bill pushes states to redetermine eligibility more frequently and with stricter oversight, which means people might lose coverage if their paperwork isn't perfect or if they miss a deadline. So for older adults who might not be as tech savvy or who don't have help with this kind of stuff, there's a risk of falling through the cracks. It's something to watch out for, especially if you rely on Medicaid to pay for care or if you have a parent or spouse who does. There's also a section about making sure deceased individuals don't remain enrolled, which sounds like a no-brainer, but it's part of a larger effort to cut down on what they're calling waste, fraud, and abuse. And while that sounds reasonable, sometimes these efforts also result in people losing benefits by mistake. And this part might surprise you. There's a change to how states can tax healthcare providers to fund Medicaid. That matters because many states use those provider taxes to help pay their share of Medicaid costs. If those rules get tightened, it might make it harder for states to keep funding their programs at current levels. And that could trickle down into things like fewer services, tighter eligibility, or even lower payments to nursing homes and home care providers. There's also language requiring states to set up community engagement requirements for certain Medicaid recipients. That basically means they want able-bodied adults to either work, volunteer, or go through some sort of job training in order to keep their Medicaid. Now, this doesn't apply to seniors. It specifically exempts people over 65, but it still matters because it could change how Medicaid is structured overall. And for older adults who rely on younger caregivers or live in multi-generational households, changes to those people's coverage can still have ripple effects. And one more thing, they're ending or phasing out some of the temporary Medicaid expansions that were put in place during COVID. Some of those expansions help people get care at home rather than in a facility, and this bill walks that back a bit. So it could mean fewer home-based services unless states decide to pick up the slack. So yeah, this section of the bill is kind of like the plumbing, not flashy, but it holds a lot together. And if you or someone in your family uses Medicaid to cover long-term care, these changes could make a real difference, especially when it comes to staying eligible and getting the right level of support. Next, let's talk about something that has more to do with how benefits are accessed. There's a section that changes identity verification rules for programs like Social Security and Medicare. And while it's meant to fight fraud, it could create some headaches if you're not ready for it. All right, so now let's get into something that might not sound like a big deal at first, but it really is, especially if you've ever had trouble with paperwork or logging into a government website. This part of the bill changes the rules around identity verification for people receiving benefits like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And on paper, it's all about preventing fraud, which is something most of us agree is important. But depending on how it's implemented, it could make it harder for some people, especially older adults, to actually access their benefits. So here's what's changing. The government is setting up stricter ID verification rules that could involve things like biometric scans, two-factor authentication, or document uploads through online portals. If you've ever had to verify your identity on a site like ID.me, you already know it could be a bit of a hassle, especially if you're not comfortable with uploading personal documents or using a webcam. Now, the bill says this new system is designed to reduce fraud and ensure that only you can access your benefits, whether it's Social Security payments, Medicare enrollment, or Medicaid applications. And sure, that makes sense. Identity theft is real, and we've seen cases where people's Social Security numbers get stolen or someone tries to claim benefits they're not entitled to. But here's the thing. This new requirement could be tough on people who don't have smartphones or who live in rural areas with limited internet access or who just aren't comfortable using tech. And that's a big chunk of the senior population. We're talking about people who still prefer to go in person or who rely on a caregiver or a trusted family member to help them manage these systems. What this means practically is that you might have to set up an online account, verify your identity digitally, and possibly do a video call or upload some kind of photo ID just to access what you've already been receiving. For some people, that's no problem. For others, it's going to be overwhelming, and it could delay or interrupt access to their monthly benefits. There's also a concern about data privacy. Some seniors have told me they're not comfortable putting their personal documents online. And while these systems are supposed to be secure, there's always that worry in the back of your mind about who has access and how it's being used. Another angle to this is representative payees, people who help manage benefits on someone else's behalf. Under this new system, they'll also have to go through stricter verification. That's great for security, but it might mean more paperwork, more delays, and more hoops to jump through, especially for caregivers who are already juggling a lot. So what should you do? The best thing is to get prepared early. If you don't already have an online Social Security or Medicare account, now might be a good time to set one up. Make sure your contact information is up to date and talk to someone you trust if you think you'll need help with identity verification. That might be a family member, a community advocate, or someone from a local senior center. And I'll be keeping an eye on this because depending on how the rollout goes, we might see updates or clarifications from the Social Security Administration or Medicare. There could be alternatives or exceptions for people who can't use digital tools. But right now, the language in the bill is pushing hard for online systems. So yeah, it's one of those behind-the-scenes changes that could have a pretty big impact. It's meant to protect you, but without enough support, it could also create new hurdles, especially if you're not super tech savvy. Next up, we're going to shift from identity rules to retirement planning, because there's a part of this bill that tweaks the saver's credit and give a little extra help to people who are trying to catch up on retirement savings later in life. All right, now let's talk about retirement, and specifically how the bill tries to encourage saving even later in life. There's a section here that enhances something called the saver's credit, which you might have heard of before, or maybe not, since it's one of those lesser-known tax benefits that tends to fly under the radar. But if you're still working and trying to save for retirement, even in your 50s or early 60s, this could actually be really helpful. So the saver's credit is a tax credit, not a deduction, for people who put money into a retirement account like an IRA or a 401k. And what this bill does is raise the maximum credit amount and expand what types of contributions can count toward the credit. It's designed to give a boost to lower and middle income earners who are still trying to build a nest egg before retirement. Under the new version, the credit amount will increase from $2,000 to $2,100 starting in 2027. And before then, it also clarifies that contributions to ABLE accounts, which are savings accounts for individuals with disabilities, will count toward the credit. So if you're helping support a disabled adult child or another dependent, this gives you another way to build security without getting penalized. So, say you contribute $1,000 to a retirement account and you qualify for the 50% credit. That's $500 straight off your tax bill. Not a deduction, but an actual reduction in what you owe. That's a big deal, especially if you're working part-time, where your income is modest and you're trying to stretch every dollar. And honestly, one of the reasons this credit is so underused is because people either don't know it exists or assume they don't qualify. So even though this isn't flashy, it's worth checking, especially if you're still working or have some self-employment income and you're making contributions to a retirement account. Also, this part ties into a broader theme in the bill, encouraging private savings so people aren't relying entirely on Social Security. That's great in theory, but in practice, a lot of people just haven't had the margin to save. So this credit acts like a bit of a backstop, a reward for trying, even if it's just a little at a time. So the big takeaway here is this: if you're still working and trying to save or helping someone else do the same, this section gives you more reason to do it. It's one of those quiet but powerful changes that could add up over time. Now, we're heading into one of the more controversial parts, something called PAYGO. And while that might sound like obscure budget talk, it could have a real effect on future Social Security and Medicare funding, depending on how things play out. Let's break that down next. So now we're getting into something that might sound a little strange at first. It's called PAYGO, short for Pay As You Go. But don't let the name fool you. This isn't just about budget math. It's a rule that could directly affect programs like Medicare and Social Security, depending on how it's enforced. So here's the basic idea. Under PAYGO, if the government wants to spend money, especially on new programs or tax cuts, it's supposed to either raise revenue or cut spending somewhere else to cover the cost. So it's meant to keep the national budget balanced over time. Sounds responsible, right? And it can be. But here's where it gets tricky. If the math doesn't work out, if new spending or tax breaks aren't paid for, then automatic cuts kick in to offset the difference. That's what they call sequestration, and it includes across-the-board cuts to certain mandatory programs. Now here's the part that makes people nervous. Programs like Medicare are technically on that list. If a big bill adds to the deficit and there's no offsetting revenue or cuts, PAYGO requires that the difference be pulled from programs like Medicare. Not immediately and not directly from Social Security, but it starts to pressure the system. In fact, under current law, if this bill adds significantly to the deficit and it is enforced without a waiver, Medicare providers could see their payments cut. And that can have ripple effects. Because if doctors and hospitals start getting paid less to treat Medicare patients, they might take fewer of them or limit services. So even though you aren't being cut directly, access can still be affected. Now, Congress often waives PAYGO rules when they pass big legislation. It's kind of become a routine move. But here's what's different. This bill doesn't automatically waive it, which means unless Congress takes another step later to prevent it, we could be looking at cuts to Medicare provider payments starting next year. And again, Social Security is not directly on the chopping block under PAYGO, but any future efforts to balance the budget under this rule could put Social Security on the table, especially with all the talk in Washington about needing to reform entitlements or make the program more sustainable. So while this section doesn't slash benefits today, it does create the framework where benefit programs could come under pressure. And a lot of folks have been asking, is this really something we should worry about? And honestly, yes, but not in a panic kind of way. It's more of a watch this closely situation. Because without a PAYGO waiver and no backup plan, Medicare could take a hit. And if lawmakers decide later to fix the math, Social Security could become part of that conversation, too. So what can you do about it? Well, the biggest thing is to stay informed and let your voice be heard. A lot of decisions about things like this happen quietly, behind the scenes, and most people don't even know what it is until it's too late. But if enough people raise concerns, Congress often acts to delay or waive those automatic cuts, and they have in the past. And just to be clear, this isn't the same thing as the trust fund running out or Social Security going bankrupt. That's a separate issue. This is about automatic budget rules that could put financial pressure on programs seniors rely on if Congress doesn't act in time. Next, we'll bring it all together and talk about what all of these changes mean in the bigger picture. Whether you're on a fixed income, approaching retirement, or just trying to keep up with it all, there's a lot to take in. Let's make sense of it. All right, so we've covered a lot, from new tax deductions for seniors, to major changes in how Social Security benefits are taxed, to prescription drug caps under Medicare, Medicaid eligibility rules, and even those behind-the-scenes updates like ID verification and PAYGO. So now let's take a step back and ask, what does all of this really mean for you? At its core, this bill, President Trump's big, beautiful bill, is trying to tackle several financial pain points that older Americans have been dealing with for years. Stuff like being taxed on your own retirement benefits, paying thousands out of pocket for medicine, or having to jump through hoops just to stay enrolled in programs you've paid into your whole life. And for a lot of people, especially if you're living on a fixed income or just trying to stretch your retirement savings, even small changes like these can make a big difference. A $6,000 tax deduction, a cap on drug costs, more protection from identity fraud. Those things might not solve everything, but they do shift the math. And sometimes that's all it takes to keep your budget balanced and your stress down. But here's the other side of it. A lot of these changes, they aren't permanent. Some expire in a few years. Others depend on how much money the government brings in or whether Congress steps in to adjust PAYGO rules or extend benefits down the road. So it's not a set it and forget it situation. It's something you've got to keep an eye on, especially if you're planning out retirement, helping a spouse or parent, or trying to make sure you're getting every benefit you've earned. And one last thing, none of this works if people don't know about it. So talk to your family, your neighbors, your senior center, your church group, whoever. A lot of these changes will happen automatically through your tax return or your benefit system, but some might require you to update info, ask questions, or double check that you're not missing out. So yeah, it's a lot, but it's also a reminder that these programs matter, that what happens in Congress doesn't just sit on paper. It shapes your budget, your medicine cabinet, your peace of mind. And as always, I'll keep tracking this and bringing you clear, calm updates that help you navigate it all. So please subscribe if you have not already, and give a thumbs up and share this if you found it helpful. Take care and stay informed.